Hi, good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's panel discussion titled The Struggle for Development and Democracy in Myanmar. The ODC is a student-run consultancy at the University of Oxford, providing pro bono research and consulting services to non-governmental organizations, development, and microfinance institutions. The ODC Symposium is our inaugural initiative to facilitate important conversations on international development by reaching beyond the Oxford student body. We have a 4-week program including discussion panels, talks, and networking events. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Thinzar Shunlei Yi, Bill Hayton, and Anna Triponel. They will be sharing their views on the ongoing political and humanitarian crisis in Myanmar, and we will move into a moderated discussion afterwards. If you wish to participate in group discussions about what you've learned after the event, kindly click on the hyperlinked text "Join here" on the symposium booklet. Now, with all the administrative details out of the way, Thinzar, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, thanks for having me here. This is Thinzar Shunlei Yi. I've been an active advocate for the young people and activist for the democracy and the human rights in the past decade. So it's my pleasure to meet you all here.
Thank you very much, Thinzar. We are very happy to have you here today as well. Bill, would you like to go next?
Thank you for the invitation and thanks for having me. So I'm Bill Hayton. I'm an associate fellow with the Asia Pacific program at Chatham House, which is a think tank in London. In 2013-14, I was seconded from my job at the BBC to go and work with the state broadcaster in Myanmar, MRTV, because the government said it wanted to turn it into a public service broadcaster. Didn't exactly work out that way, but I got a sort of a year-long ringside seat as the preparations were made for the 2015 general election. So I've been keeping an eye on developments in Myanmar since then.
Thank you very much, Bill. It's a pleasure to have you here today. And last but not least, you have Anna as well. She's a business and human rights advisor at Triponel Consulting, and she'll introduce herself when it's a segment later on. So with that, I'm very pleased to be inviting Thinzar to share her presentation with us right now. Thinzar, please.
Working for Myanmar democracy and human rights with the grassroots organization for the past 10 years. I want to share more about the current updates, like a quick update, and also what are the narratives that we want you, the international communities, and all of our friends around the world to know about, because we want to be the ones who are shaping these narratives our own. So I would love to share the screen here. So what I'm presenting does not represent my organizations or any organizations. As a young activist working with young people, youth movement in the past 10 years as well as right now, they're in the revolutions. So what are the updates? It's been nearly 100 days. We are in the 4th month of the after the coup. So the news, the coverage of what's happening in the country might be lesser. It's already lesser than previous time, but we need to make sure that we need to be clear that these killings by the military, the security forces, keep going almost every day. So recently, this person, he was a poet, and in my hometown, Moyoi, he was killed after being abducted by the military and without warrants, and he was just a poet, joining in the strike, leading the strikes, and after 24 hours, his body was given back to the family with missing body parts. So this is a very recent case. We have nearly 800 people killed already, and some of us are our own friends. We have more than 500 people arrested and more than 1,000 being issued warrants. And I was issued warrants in the mid-April. I'm currently in hiding, but still not silencing my own voice, because this is the own self-defense, like the freedom of expression I'm defending. So I'm joining you guys. It's a pleasure that I still have a voice to talk to you. So the international community must be aware of what's happening in Myanmar. Some people might find it new, but for us who have been living through the military dictatorship, who was brought up and under the military dictatorship, we find what's happening in Myanmar is nothing new, but it's ongoing. It's ongoing. And recently, we should not forget what happened to our ethnic minorities group, Karen, Kachin. 3 years ago, I was persecuted by the government for I organized a peaceful protest for the trapped ITPs, internally displaced person in Kachin states. So these atrocity I lived through with these killing, arbitrary arrests and killing almost every day. That happened in Oregon State, that happened to Rohingya recently, and these are all committed with complete impunity. And military dictatorship in the country, they committed a coup in 1st February, but their intention and their mission is not yet complete because their resistance is so strong that they can't run their operations. So we need to make sure that military coup is not yet successful. And we have recently formed a national unity government out of CRPH, the committee representative formed with the elected representative of the 2020 election. So this national unity government is not that 100% perfect, but it's the only legitimate government of Myanmar, and we accept their orders. We will follow their orders, their instruction, as a civilian in the country. So they are not shadow or parallel government of the country. They are the only legitimate government of Myanmar. This is what we have to be careful when they report about what's happening in the country. And regarding the revolution is more in the evolution way. It's not just happened out of the coup. So on the first phase, in the first phase of the revolution, the people demanded to release all the arrested politicians, the leaders, and to restore the government, to legitimize the parliaments and such. So, but as long as the revolution goes on, as long as the protests go on, many people got more aware of the situation that it is not the first time that military just get away with this kind of impunity, and we want to make sure we are eventually revolving against this system once and for all. So we are now having 3 main front lines. The first is political and an ideological revolution. So for the political revolution, we have national level non-violence and civil disobedience movement. Everybody's aware of the CDM. It's been joined by civilians, not just by the civilian, but also recently the Mandalay Civil Society Organization, they joined the movement as they boycotted all forms of cooperation with the military coup council and their department. So we have a very strong and civil disobedience movement stay going, and many of our civilians kept saying they will do CDM till their last breath. Nothing can change their mindsets. So this is one of them. And at the same time, on the international front, the diplomatic relation is ongoing, claiming the legitimacy worldwide. At the same time, including civil society, international human rights organizations are pushing for the targeted sanction on the military general and their businesses. So they are like a military empire with all the businesses running around, and they are still cooperating with the wines and gas sector. So for example, recently we've been pushing for the Chevron, Total from Korea and US to cut their ties with the military. So this is a very recent updates. We are also pushing for other different sectors as well. And the forming of CRPH and UG is totally a political move, political resistance for the federal democratic nations. So for that, to build a federal democratic nations, we are in the stage that forming a bill, we are building trust among the ethnic stakeholder, different political stakeholder, mainly to draft interim constitution, which could help us which could help us facilitate, our process toward a federal democratic nation with the federal army, and after we have election for a new federal government. So this is what we are looking for, and the main reason why we are doing this political revolution is to ensure we are throwing out the military council, the terrorist council existence from all forms of political arenas. So we are recently we denounced the action of WHO and UNODC for they invited the military coup council members to their meeting. So we don't accept any relation with the military coup council. So also recently the vice president just say they won't negotiate with the military regarding the political. So because we've been living through this, compromising, and still we face similar atrocity again and again. So we don't want to be betrayed anymore, and we are now loyal to our own revolution. And there is another end resistance also uprising. And the federal government has just formed interim government formed People's Defense Force under the guidance of Ministry of Defense, and mainly to defend the people, because people are being killed, almost every day with nobody in between. Totally, there is total injustice happening. So we hope the PDF, People's Defense Force, might help us, intimidate the military from killing freely of our civilians. So also to reduce atrocity by the military. And this initial stage might help us to form a federal army with the involvement of ethnic ends army across the country. So this is what's happening with the end resistance and revolution. At the same time, we are clearly informed about the revolution shouldn't just be all about ends or violations or violence or explosion or of just forming a government. We all really have to make sure that all our generations have that ideological change. So we lived through the military propaganda for the past 6 decades, and it's really, really hard to root out the military propaganda. For example, the fear is so normalized inside this community, different communities. So they've been using the fear cat to divide and rule the country. So we are now resisting, especially the young generation. We are against extremism, nationalism, militarism, hegemonism, supremacism, and racism. So we have many young people joining our campaign called We Are Rohingya, for example, to show their solidarity with the most oppressed minorities. So this is the positive side of the revolution, despite all our failure and all our, fallen comrades. And so the international community, I wish to propose 3 main things. The first is to be sensitive with the situation, because it's changing, evolving almost every day. So how to be sensitive? The communities needs to be consultative with the civil society, and if you are government, if you are diplomatic or the countries, then you need to consult with the legitimate political, socio-economic, education bodies that we have already formed. We were gonna have a newly formed Human Rights Commission as well. We already have a Human Rights Ministry. So there are different people being assigned to these positions to ensure the international community don't get lost with the consultation. So they are there for that, and to be supported of the situations that for the humanitarian aids through the ethnic health organizations near the border areas. Many people have been doing that work for the past decades, many decades. Education for the young people, health, economic support through the SMEs in the country, because there will be targeted sanctions for the military. So the military empire, the business empire will collapse. So we need to replace these empire with our own businesses, and civil society need to be supported. Ethnic organization and UN, they can be the facilitator in between. So these are the three main things that international communities can help with. So the last but not the least, we have learned our own ways how to live through the dictatorship. It's nothing new to us. It's nothing surprising to us, the killing, the impunities. So we know our way, we have our own way. So revolution is also in full swing for a reason. And people are now boycotting their businesses for a reason. So we shouldn't just forget the main perpetrator in the whole room, the main elephant, the big elephant is the military. So whenever you are doing, whatever you are saying, we need to ensure that you are talking to the military first, because they're the main perpetrator, they're the big elephant in the room. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Thinzar, for providing such in-depth insight into the local situation in Myanmar. And now, could we please invite Bill to share his thoughts on the political crisis in Myanmar?
Great, thank you very much. And it was very impressive and sobering account of what life is like in Myanmar at the moment. And I guess the question that we're trying to look at here is where do we go? Where does Myanmar go from here? How does it get out of the crisis? I mean, the number of people being killed and injured and detained is going up all the time. The Myanmar military, the Tatmadaw, is returning to a pattern of behavior that had disappeared, at least from the sort of the lowland Bamar majority areas, 10 years ago. And has basically thrown away all that progress towards democracy, development, better society, and all the rest of it that had been developing over the past 10 years. But I think we have to deal with the situation as it is, rather than as we would like it to be. And for me, the overwhelming factor in this is that you have a Myanmar military, the Tatmadaw, approximately 300,000 soldiers under arms, reasonably well equipped with heavy weapons and planes and helicopters, another 100,000 or so armed police on top of that. And they're fighting disparate groups of ethnic armed organizations who don't really, kind of coordinate that well between one another. You have a new wave of democracy activists moving into the border areas, maybe joining up with them. But they're in no way are they 300,000 strong. They haven't got heavy weapons. We're not, I think, very likely to see an armed overthrow of the Tatmadaw, of the Myanmar military anytime soon. And even if you go back to one of the worst days of the uprising, the 27th of March, which was Armed Forces Day, we saw that all 5 of Myanmar's neighbors turned up to attend a military parade in Naypyidaw. So that's China, India, Thailand, Laos, and Bangladesh all sent representatives to basically a big party with the military on a day that maybe 100 people were shot dead in the streets outside. And Vietnam, Pakistan, and Russia also sent delegates to that event. Vietnam sells an awful lot of communications equipment to Myanmar and has its Ministry of Defense owned telecoms company, Viettel, has a joint venture with Mitel, the military-run mobile phone company in Myanmar. Russia sells an awful lot of military hardware to the Myanmar military as well. So if all of Myanmar's neighbors are working with, or at least, recognizing the military government, it's going to be very difficult for outsiders to isolate the country. I mean, how, for example, it would be impossible to impose some kind of no-fly zone over the border areas where the Myanmar military are sending planes to attack the ethnic minority rebels, for example, if you don't have the support of Thailand and China and India and these other countries. Now, we've been here before, as Thinzar Shunlei Yi was saying. There were coups and repression after protests in 1988, and then again in 2007. And the military is once again demonstrating that it is willing, quite prepared, sometimes even eager to use extreme brutality to try and squash anything that's going to undermine its position in society. We also have a very vibrant pro-democracy movement, thinking big about the kind of country that they would like to create. But the two are moving in radically different directions and polarizing the society. And I think that's going to lead to less of a chance of any kind of reconciliation. Although we're in a similar situation to maybe those two periods, there are some differences. And I think that the three most important are the rise of China. And that means that whereas in the past, countries in Europe and the United States, Japan may have been willing, or eventually willing to impose economic sanctions and isolation on the Myanmar military. Now there's a sense that in the regional competition between China and the US, China and Japan, China and India, but no one wants to isolate or be left out of Myanmar in case China makes advances. And so therefore that, I think, limits the overall diplomatic options for a lot of the international community. There's also, I think, after the experience of the economic sanctions against Myanmar, or Burma as it was back then, there's a lot of cynicism or reluctance to use broad-based economic sanctions. They were felt to be ineffective or counterproductive, that they helped to enrich certain people in the military leadership without helping the mass people of Myanmar. So that's another factor, I think, which is different now to then. But of course, the other factor is the internet connectivity, that we know a lot more about what's going on in Myanmar now, because Myanmar is so much more connected to the world than it ever was before, say, 2011. What hasn't changed, I think, is the determination of the military to remain in charge and their willingness to use extreme violence in order to do so. So where does the crisis go from here? And I think, much as everybody on this call would like to see Myanmar transition to a full democracy as quickly as possible, I do think it's unlikely. Positions are becoming more extreme. The pro-democracy group is becoming more radical, thinking bigger thoughts about ending the military's role in the country and the constitution, completely forming the basis of society from a sort of unitary Bamar-dominated state towards a federation which gives greater rights to the ethnic groups around the country's margins. And that all of those things are obviously anathema to the military. So the military are digging in ever tighter, ever deeper, planning new elections that would take place within a year or two. And I think what they want to do is go back to their original vision of what they call a disciplined, flourishing democracy, i.e. the form of democracy, but one which operates very much within the lines that the military sees itself as the guiding power in the country, and just sort of tolerating a bit of dissent here and there, but really not allowing it to affect the running of the country. I think they thought that they had achieved that with their constitution, but then they recognized and they came to realize that actually the people were not willing to go along with that. So that was the reason why we ended up with the coup. Now the situation in Yangon, I think, is that the military have used sufficient terror to intimidate a lot of the protests off the street. We're now sort of seeing sort of guerrilla style protests, short episodes, 15 minutes, everybody gets together, walks down the street, shouts, and then disperses before the military can catch up with them. We're also seeing, I think, the economic impact of the protests means that some of the strikes are getting weaker. I think the banks are reopening, this kind of thing. So people don't have the resources to kind of continue these strikes indefinitely, and that's means that regrettable as it may be, that some aspects of life are returning to quote normal in Yangon. Obviously, normal is a very relative concept there, but in terms of people having to go to work and to survive, we're seeing a return to something like the situation before the coup to a degree. So I think there's going to be a real problem as to where we go from here. The ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the 10 countries of Southeast Asia, 10 including Myanmar, are attempting to start some kind of protest, some kind of process that de-escalates the situation. And I guess for the optimists, you might say that there's been a reduction in the level of violence since ASEAN became more involved. ASEAN is wanting to take control. It doesn't want outside powers to be starting to throw their weight around in the region. And to some extent, the outside powers, the Europeans, the British, the Japanese, the Americans, are more than happy to let ASEAN take the responsibility for this. So the question is, how can ASEAN, the various states of ASEAN, pressure the Myanmar military into any kind of concessions or dialogue process? Would some kind of targeted sanctions have any effect on the Myanmar leadership? Or will they be able to, for example, use the profits from jade mines, which are notoriously difficult to control, to sort of maintain power, and their other economic tools that they control through their military-owned holding companies. Specifically, I think Thailand and Vietnam are covering for the Myanmar military. They are both quite intimately connected in a business and political level. So when people get upset with ASEAN, really, I think they need to be more specific about which governments are more interested in criticizing and causing change and which are less interested. The international community is in a very difficult position here, I think. They're thinking about how to reduce the overall level of violence, whether that be from protests or fighting in the ethnic minority areas, but also the impact of COVID and just the impact of decades of underdevelopment and poverty in the country, and how you engage and make sure that the loss of life is as little as possible, and that the return to some kind of order and progress is as short as or as quick as possible. I'm afraid I kind of see that ultimately that the military are going to have some role in the future of Myanmar, much as we would like it not to be the case. And that part of the role of the international community is going to be to persuade, unfortunately, the democracy groups, to moderate some of their demands and to recognize the reality. And I think that's going to be a tough process over the following months and years. I'll leave it there, and I think we might pick up some of these issues in the discussion, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill, for offering kind of the perspective of a realist and for kind of teasing out the political implications of potential solutions to this political crisis. Thank you very much for sharing. Now, could we please invite Anna for a presentation, please?
Thank you. I want to echo how timely this conversation is. I was just looking at Bill's Twitter feed over the weekend, and he has an excellent graph there where he's showing how the level of interest in this coup has completely died down when it comes to Google searches, and we can't stop continuing the focus as Thinzar shows us. This is absolutely critical. So thank you for bringing us together today. My name is Anna Triponel. I'm a business and human rights advisor. I want to tell you just a little bit about my experience with Myanmar because it helps to serve as the backdrop for my remarks today. Back in 2007, I was an international lawyer based in New York, and I worked with the opposition to challenge the legitimacy of the military junta at the United Nations. I saw through that process just how limited the options are to dislodge a military once entrenched. I joined the team at Harvard Kennedy School, working on the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. This document endorsed at the UN level in 2011 has become the authoritative framework of what can be expected of companies when it comes to human rights. I'll speak about that a little bit later. When Myanmar opened up to business in 2012, I traveled around the country to hear from people, from workers, communities, what do they want on the part of companies entering the country? And I spoke about this on behalf of Shift at the World Economic Forum in 2013. Since then, I've been working with companies and investors investing in Myanmar, And in 2018, I worked on the US State Department commissioned investigation into the Rohingya that was published by PLPG. And I've been doing a lot of work with companies since then. So today, I will be describing the kinds of human rights dilemmas companies are facing in Myanmar since the military coup of February the 1st. And I'll speak to the role expected of companies to lead to an improved human rights situation for those on the ground. Now, as a former lawyer, my introduction wouldn't be complete without a disclaimer. So let me just go for it. I speak on an individual basis. Nothing I say represents companies or organizations I work with. And all the examples I might be providing are based on publicly reported information. The opening up of Myanmar attracted investments in businesses from a wide range of sectors: energy, telecommunications, manufacturing, beverages, food, apparel, finance, the list goes on. Since February the 1st, all of these businesses have been faced with stark human rights dilemmas. To illustrate the concept of human rights dilemmas, I'm going to discuss two real-life examples from the energy and the telecommunications sectors. I select these two because of their importance to the military. We're talking energy and we're talking networks. And because CEOs in those sectors have recently been vocal about the dilemmas they face, these examples are intended to illustrate the kinds of human rights dilemmas faced by companies in practice in Myanmar and what can and should be expected of the private sector today. The first example comes from French energy company Total. Total produces gas on the Yadana, Sime and Badamyar fields located off Myanmar's southwest coast. The gas from the fields here is sold to the Thai company PTT, and PTT uses the gas to generate about 8% of electricity in Thailand. Total also supplies around 50% of the gas used to generate electricity for Yangon. Okay, so what are the human rights dilemmas faced by a company like Total? In a widely reported op-ed published on the 3rd of April, Patrick Pouyanné, Total CEO, discusses the three human rights dilemmas he sees for the company. First, Total has been asked not to pay taxes. We heard about this earlier, not to pay taxes to the military and to pay this into an escrow account. This would mean withholding $4 million on a monthly basis from the military's coffers. The argument goes that by paying this money to the military, Total is strengthening, entrenching the military and financing its crimes. Pouyanné responds that the company could do that, but in turn, this would put local managers at risk. They could be prosecuted. They could be put into jail, since non-payment of taxes is a criminal offense. Second, Total has been asked to discontinue its gas operations in Myanmar, to stop operations altogether. Pouyanné responds, the company could do this, but that in turn would deprive half of Yangon, 2.5 million people, from electricity, which, in his words, would lead to greater suffering, for instance, by hindering the operations of hospitals and businesses. Third dilemma, Pouyanné notes that if the company were to stop the operations, the chances are high that local authorities could resort to forced labor, to force local employees to continue working. And he makes the case that this has been known to happen in the past, and it could happen again. Therefore, in this instance, Total chooses to condemn the repressive action taking place, to discontinue any new operations, but to continue the ongoing operations and paying taxes, while at the same time providing the equivalent money to civil society organizations working on human rights in the country. Let's move to our second example, a Norwegian telecommunications company, Telenor. And Bill touched upon the role of the networks here. Telenor is one of two foreign operators in Myanmar, alongside Ooredoo. Telenor connects people in Myanmar, serving around a third of the population. On the day of the coup, the military ordered Telenor and other operators to shut down the networks. The orders from the military went from, you shall block social media sites like Facebook, to, you shall block internet services during the night, to, you shall more or less cease all mobile and wireless services. The question then becomes, how do we comply with military orders? Do we comply with them or do we not comply with the orders? And maybe put our local staff and the small access we still have at risk. Just last week, Sigve Brekke, Telenor's CEO, said that the entirety of the company's investment in Myanmar, that's $782 million, it needs to be written off. It's being written off, but that they will not exit the country. He says that by staying present, the company can shine a spotlight on the military orders and try and exercise leverage to make a difference, including, for instance, being the first teleco company to speak out vocally against the new proposed security law. Now, these human rights dilemmas are not easy to navigate. What are the ground rules for companies navigating these dilemmas? These are captured in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Companies in Myanmar are expected to act on responsibility. This is a responsibility. It's not about voluntary or feel-good actions. Companies in Myanmar are expected to consider the risks to people that exist in their business, taking a full value chain perspective. Companies in Myanmar are expected to prioritize preventing and mitigating the most severe risks to people, not because they have a reputational risk, not because they feel they want to prioritize something that is feasible to the detriment of something that isn't feasible. No, they prioritize whether or not it's feasible, where the risks to people are the most severe. They're expected to build and exercise leverage to improve outcomes for people. And they're expected to consider disengagement when improved outcomes are not possible. So what does this mean for the situation in Myanmar? How do these ground rules apply in practice? Just a few of the reflections of how this translates in practice. Could the company's actions or omissions result in harming people, including through its value chain? This could be, for instance, compelling workers to travel to your office, even though it's unsafe and they could get shot on the way to work. It has happened in Myanmar. Could the company's business, including through its business relationships, facilitate the military's operations? For instance, am I providing logistical support? Am I financing some of these crimes? Is the company dedicating efforts to where the risks to people are and could be the most severe? In other words, are companies staying strong to mitigate where it really matters, or are they taking an easier route because it's hard to stay strong? Now, here's where I get to the core of my argument. Yes, under international methodology, companies are expected to look at addressing impacts in their value chain. Impacts that happen outside of the company's value chain are viewed as beyond the company's responsibility. But of course, the operating context within which companies operate play a critical role. An operating context of military dictatorship, where strong men do not shy away from shooting people for raising their voice, amplifies significantly the chances that companies will be connected to adverse human rights impacts in their business. These impacts are suddenly much more likely to occur and at a much greater level of severity. Therefore, companies cannot shy away from playing a role in the broader political developments that are happening as we speak. It is part of their responsibility to help build towards a foundation of human rights respect. This entails a thoughtful and considered reflection on the part of companies. What leverage does my company have over the military? How could I use it to ease the country back on the path to democracy? What leverage does my company have over other stakeholders in Myanmar? How could I use it to ease the country back on the path to democracy? What can I do to build my leverage over the situation? And what role can I play to push political players to use tools in their diplomatic toolbox to weaken the military over time? Companies can't be operating in a right-respecting way in a country that operates on the basis of flagrant human rights violations. To conclude, by choosing to operate in a country emerging from dictatorship, whether they like it or not, companies have become part of the panoply of international actors and institutions that have a responsibility to embrace and seek to enhance human rights and rule of law standards. If companies don't do it to meet their responsibility to respect human rights, they should do it for Dao Miao Miao Ai, arrested for her trade union membership. They should do it for 19-year-old Mia Kiao-zin, killed for protesting for democracy. They should do it for 6-year-old Kim Yo-chit, killed in her house by the military while she was running to her dad's arms. Private sector entities have more weight than they think. There has never been a better time to think creatively and strategically about leverage. We owe it to the people of Myanmar, who welcomed us in with open arms into their country to find a way to break the direction of travel here and put the country back on the pathway to respect for people's fundamental rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. That was a brilliant presentation on the private sector's role in actually effecting political change in Myanmar. So now we've heard from Thinzar Shunlei Yi, Bill, and Anna on the political and humanitarian crisis in Myanmar, and now we'll be moving to a moderated discussion based on what we've heard earlier. So my first question to all three panelists would be, what does the resolution of Myanmar's political crisis look like to you? Perhaps we could start with Thinzar Shunlei Yi, if she doesn't mind.
So the resolution that we want to see is already on its way, but we need more of the stakeholder involved and join in the cause. The NUG, National Unity Government, is already doing its job, to build trust among the different ethnic nationalities and different stakeholders. So we need more of the international, in terms of politics. So they don't recognize the Cook Council, and they recognize the NUG, and they deal with that. So this is what the resolution should look like for the international communities. For us, the resolution, the political aim is already there to form a federal democratic nation. So for that, we have we have a roadmap. We need to have an interim constitution. We're gonna have a federal army ourselves, and then again the election for all of us. So this is where we want to go. And through this revolution, we're learning a lot from the whole process. The resolution that we want to see is on its way, and everyone have to just support. That's what I think is resolution look like.
Thank you very much, Thinzar Shunlei Yi. I think building on her point about the near future of realizing a federated democratic nation, and also the entrance of the National Unity Government as a new political player in Myanmar's political arena. Bill, what are your thoughts on this? Because as you've mentioned earlier, the military has always played a very significant role in Myanmar politics. Do you see the entrance of the NUG as a formidable contending force? What are your views on this?
Well, I feel very conflicted, because if it was up to me, that would be the solution that I would like to see. I'd love to see, the advocates of democracy, the advocates of federalism, all the sort of lively debates which are taking place among the pro-democracy forces now about how to build a better society. But I just don't see how you get from here to there without, there's no route I see to removing the military, and ultimately that's what it comes down to. I would love to believe that it were possible, but the Tamadors survived years, decades of sanctions in the past. They have all kinds of murky connections to jade mines and drug smuggling and all the rest of it, that will provide, if the worst comes to the worst, they'll nationalize the banks and steal everybody's money just to basically make sure that they've got enough to pay for their own salaries and weapons and all the rest of it. So therefore the whole basis of ASEAN's involvement is to bring the two sides together. It's not to eliminate the military. So the kind of whole thrust of international engagement is going to be to try to persuade the Myanmar military to tone down some of its worst elements of the repression, and to begin a process that starts to move the country towards civilian rule. Now, that may not be a democratic civilian rule. It may be, some kind of new version of the USDP, the sort of military-backed party or something like that takes power, and then maybe we'll be on another 5-year process towards some kind of election which allows more people to take part. I mean, we're talking years, I think, here, rather than kind of weeks or months, and I realize that's a terribly depressing message for people, but I think that's the way that the international community is thinking about this.
Thanks, Bill. Anna, what are your thoughts on this?
Thanks, Callista. Yeah, I want to echo that. I think we're forgetting a little bit that it wasn't a democracy before. And when I worked on investigations of the Rohingya to demonstrate that a genocide had been perpetrated, we worked with investigators who had worked on genocides around the world, and they've never seen anything like it, the scale of it. And this happened on the watch of the former government because of the setup, the way it was. There was total impunity for the military that existed back, in the day. So this is a process to get to, over time, dislodging the military in a way that we can get back to civilian rule. And that entails a number of different pieces of the puzzle that together will make it, but no one single piece will make it. And we have to be strategic and smart about what those pieces are. We know that militaries rule, they need power, they want legitimacy. They don't need it, but they want it, and they need money. So what can we do to take away and chip away from the legitimacy and the money? So many different things. Should not be recognizing the coup, sanctions that make sense, withholding membership of ASEAN and others, arms embargoes, non-stop demands to release political prisoners, stop talking to other representatives, and really supporting what's the people on the ground. So I think we need to just think strategically about what all those pieces are and start to slot them together to see the bigger picture.
Thank you very much, Anna, for your input. I just wanted to build on what you've mentioned earlier about implementing sanctions that make sense. So as Bill has pointed out very rightly early on, sanctions tend to have counterproductive effects where they actually harm the people and nourish the military instead of actually curtailing the power of the military. So what do you think are more meaningful alternatives to economic sanctions on Myanmar? And what is the role of private enterprise in this calculus?
Is that for me, Calista? Yeah, perfect. So when the coup happened, I came out very strongly for the private sector to back sanctions because I felt that there was still time where the military could be dislodged without losing face. And it was a case of sort of, if we all go at it in a way now, there's a possibility to pivot where we're going. That didn't happen. So we are where we are now. So I think sanctions will play a different role today. There's an excellent article I read recently in The Economist where they go through all the different sanctions and what it's achieved. And really, I think everyone knows that there are significant limits to what sanctions can do. But again, it's about sort of in combination with others. I think we've got to take a step back and, we've touched upon it. Where does the military get its resources? Where does it get its power? And start to chip away at that. That does mean bringing in, we can't do it alone. We need to bring in others. We've heard before about the many neighbours and different entities and organisations that play a role in ensuring that the military stands strong. So it has to be a broader vision here to think about weakening the military over time.
Very much. I wanted to bring the discussion a bit back to the title of today's panel, which is The Struggle for Democracy and Development in Myanmar. And the title implicitly suggests that democracy and development go hand in hand. But from what we're hearing today in this very fruitful discussion is that sometimes the struggle for democracy is carrying on at the expense of lives, and also economic opportunities. And there is, we recognize a need to return to some sort of normalcy for the people, and also that there is a running shortage of resources to continue the democratic struggle against the military and the Tatmadaw. So in your view, do you think there is a potential trade-off between the continuing struggle for democracy and salvaging Myanmar's social and economic circumstances? How do you think we should navigate this dilemma and this trade-off? Bill, would you want to start us off?
Okay, I mean, when it became independent, Burma was the richest country in Southeast Asia. It's now the poorest country in Southeast Asia. So that's what the military and the lack of democracy have done for Myanmar, to destroy its economy. in the years after 2011, as the country moved towards democracy and opening up, and after 2015, its economy started to, to live up to its potential. And so it did seem as if democracy and development were going hand in hand. Suddenly, international investors were willing to be there and to create an engine for economic growth. And now we're back, and as we heard, Telenor writing off its entire investment, the Japanese beer maker Kirin, moving out of its beer investments and other things. And we're seeing, crisis. I mean, if you're interested in making garments, you're not going to open a factory in Yangon now. You're going to go to Bangladesh or Cambodia or somewhere else like that. So those jobs for those people, semi-skilled workers in garment factories, they're not going to be around for some time. So the country is going to go through a critically poor period, I think, for the next couple of years. And obviously with COVID going around and everything else, it's a terrible storm for people. I mean, even people in cities, and let alone people living in villages, where there's, they don't see electricity or clean running water. So the level of deprivation in some parts of rural Myanmar, has to be seen, I think, to be understood. I can remember taking a train journey, looking out of the window, and you just see nothing. There are no lights, for example. Just testament to that lack of electricity. So yeah, I mean, and the pressure is going to be on. How do you help the people of Myanmar? Will you therefore invest or maintain your operations in order to make sure that some people have a livelihood? Can it be channeled through humanitarian aid? Is that going to be reliable? I guess that'll be what people try and do. But I mean, it's an incredibly difficult situation, I think.
Thanks, Bill. Thinzar Shunlei Yi, would you like to add to this?
Yes. So I think what's happening in the country right now is people have already decided to go through this revolution part, despite all these challenges that we have, the risks, the risks of being killed on the street, but people still choose to resist. And even if there are no sanctions by international communities or any corporate or private companies, the people were sanctioned by themselves. People were sanctioned the military businesses inside the country. Despite, even if we don't have no choices, they won't use the products, and they're getting aware of their products and the impact that they could make, and they don't want to be one of them who gave power to military to kill their civilian, their people, their civilian, their friends, their police, so that. So Myanmar people have already decided to boycott all the military businesses. Why the foreign companies and the community are hesitating to do that? So that's the question that we have, because we have paid our price and we know the outcome, but we still demand, and we are the ones who demand the sanctions. So and the companies, of course, they will be at risk. The company staff will be at risk when they do the sanction. But are you sure you can guarantee their life will be safe, even if you don't do sanction? Because the military is killing just arbitrarily. Anybody can get killed without any notice. We will never know that, because now what we are looking for is a coordinated sanction, coordinated actions on the military, not just by the democracy country, but also from our neighbors, from our, from Asian countries like India, Korea, Japan. What are they doing now? So that's the main thing that I think. So the trade-off is not going to happen, because recently, just yesterday, the vice president of the National Unity Government just declared there will be no negotiations with the military. The military has only one option, is just to surrender to the people. And military is already out of the game. If you like it or not, the reality, they are in power with all the weapons, but they are already out of the political game. They already are no more in our hearts. We don't accept that anymore, and we are the majority of the country. We are the future. Thank you.
Thank you for that really powerful statement, Thinzar Shunlei Yi. I really appreciate and admire the will and courage of the people. And I just wanted to build on what you have said earlier in your sharing that the rise of a new generation of Myanmar youth who are definitely more conscious about human rights and the protection of them, and also raising international awareness about the atrocities that are happening in Myanmar currently. I was wondering what do you envision the role of Myanmar youth to be in this political crisis, and moving forward, how could we kind of uplift the voices of a new generation in order to bring about and effect greater political change in Myanmar in future?
So young people in the country, they are always at the front lines whenever there is, the battles for their democracy or human rights. When we look at 2007 revolution or 1988, the students are always at the front line. But the main thing is these young people are not placed in the power positions when there is the power positions. So what we are doing is, what we are ensuring is so the government should be intergenerational to ensure it should be inclusive. So this is a way that we are forming our own future by shaping the national unity governments. Now we can see one of the protest leader, who is only 27 years old, is already a deputy minister, and we already have the youth ministry. We've been asking for it. Now we have that. So this kind of progress gives us hope to keep going. And the young people, we believe we are the present leaders. We are shaping the narrative, where we want to go, and we are always taking risks. We dare to take risks, and I think the young generations are leading the movement, leading for the new nations right now.
Thank you very much, Thinzar Shunlei Yi. I just wanted to bring the discussion back to pressure placed on the Tatmadaw in the international arena. So earlier, Thinzar Shunlei Yi has touched on domestic agitation against the military and the people's attempts to overthrow the military through determination and will. And I wanted to go back to Bill's point on ASEAN's role in bringing about change and resolution of the conflict. So I wanted to ask Bill about his opinions on whether ASEAN is well placed to lead efforts to resolve Myanmar's political crisis, since earlier you've touched on internal divisions within ASEAN, where Thailand and Vietnam are more sympathetic to the junta, whereas countries like Indonesia, Singapore, and Malaysia are more critical and have been advocating for the Myanmar military to seize, violations of human rights and so on. So, do you think ASEAN will succumb to its internal divisions, or do you think it is well placed to lead diplomatic efforts to pressure the military into considering some sort of political resolution and to convince them to cease their human rights violations?
Well, I think ASEAN is the best organization to do the job that it's taken upon itself, because it's in the region. It has the personal connections with everybody in the country that are going to be needed. That doesn't mean to say that it's a perfect organization, or its structures are well suited to what the job entails, because it has to work at the level of consensus. So if one country disagrees, then it can't reach a common position. But it doesn't mean that individual countries, the other 9 members of ASEAN, can't do anything. And as you say, Indonesia and Malaysia have been leading some of the push. Traditionally, the Philippines was always one of the most pro-democracy countries, but under Mr. Duterte, there's some sign of that, but it's not as obvious. But I think you can kind of see that Brunei, as the chair, although it's a tiny country, doesn't want to see ASEAN weakened under its watch. So you can kind of see how there's an incentive now. And now that ASEAN has come out and pulled a statement together, the 5-part consensus, as it was called, it means that ASEAN's credibility is now on the line. And so if the Myanmar junta start to basically, kind of ignore ASEAN and humiliate ASEAN, then we're going to start making a big mistake, because at that point, I think, people are going to start to question the value of ASEAN, and ASEAN governments are going to say, right, okay, now we have to do something. and they're going to get increasingly serious about that. So the Tamador, the junta's response to the ASEAN summit was basically, thanks for the suggestions, we'll take it from here. Basically, we'll try and ignore what you're going to say. But if they keep going down that path, ASEAN is going to get, or the ASEAN member states are going to get upset with them, even the ones that are sort of reluctant to intervene directly, with that kind of, basic rudeness towards ASEAN. And it's going to take a while, but there's going to be pressure. We've got the foreign ministers meetings, I think will be in August, and then usually the leaders meetings will be in November. Will the ministers want to sit next to a kind of a junta representative who isn't playing ball at all? Is there going to be increasing pressures to restrict their participation? Perhaps. I mean, this might start to happen. It's obviously far too slow, and if people are being killed on the streets right now, every death is a tragedy. But I don't see any other alternative to a gradual increasing in the diplomatic pressure. And then maybe the ASEAN states will start to think about where their points of leverage are. Can the Thais, for example, could they find another 5% of their electricity generation from somewhere else, for example, and stop saying, okay, we're not going to renew our contract. Would the Vietnamese be willing to, remove some of the support they provide? Would Singapore start to put blocks on some of the bank accounts, that it holds for Myanmar companies? That kind of thing. I think it'll start to happen, but it won't happen very quickly.
Thank you, Bill. And final question for Anna. So earlier, Anna has stressed the significant role that private enterprise and the private sector can play in facilitating, diplomatic pressure on the junta, and also in alleviating the humanitarian situation in Myanmar as well. And I would like to ask Anna, what do you think this looks like, especially given that certain state-owned enterprises, I'm thinking those in China, have been playing quite a pivotal role in providing essential services to the people of Myanmar and so on. So how do you think the private sector can actually perhaps facilitate diplomatic action?
Thanks, Callista. It starts with wanting to play that role. And as I, argued in my remarks, I think companies absolutely have to be thinking about that and have it on their radar. Of course, one easy sort of out is, well, we provide this stuff over here, and that's great. So we're not going to actually use any of our leverage over here. But what that looks like as a first step is better understanding, exactly what Bill has described. What will it take to start to isolate, dislodge, weaken the military over time? As a private sector entity, I'm not just watching. I actually have a role. To Bill's example on Thailand, PTT is there buying. What is PTT's role? And do they, when they are asked, or do they suggest to the Thai government, are they going to say, no, we don't want any change? Or are they actually going to proactively embrace it? So it's about building understanding of the situation, knowing what role the diplomatic sort of toolbox gives you, and how you as a private sector can further enhance and push on some of those levers. I've seen in other contexts that oftentimes governments and diplomats and those that are sort of navigating this, they assume that companies won't want to come along or won't want this because it's all disrupt their operations. I think they would be surprised at how willing companies could come along if they knew what the end game could be, because right now there's no business that's going to be possible in the long run in Myanmar. So maybe it's an action now that might seem a little bit, might be a bit painful, might be a challenge to put in place, but you're guaranteeing some level of business in the longer term in Myanmar. So it's really about, I would say, it's creating the connection between everything that's happening up here, sort of in terms of the diplomacy, all of those discussions we know are taking place, and the role that private sector can play to amplify that, to give more tools in the toolbox, because right now that connection isn't really taking place.
Thank you very much, Anna. And with that, I think this concludes a very fruitful discussion among our three panelists. So firstly, I would just like to extend my greatest thanks to all of you for taking the time to speak about a very important and pertinent situation that's going on. Like what Anna said, this has kind of dropped off our radars for a bit since it's quite a protracted conflict, but this doesn't mean that we should just cast it aside, but we should still continue continue understanding the situation and mobilizing the international community to discuss it and also offer our assistance to domestic groups and pressure groups in Myanmar as well. So we'd just like to thank you again for your time. We would be having another session on Thursday titled Safeguarding the Rights and Well-being of Refugees and the Forcibly Displaced on Thursday, 13th of May at 5 p.m. British time. So if any of the participants would like to attend that, please make sure that you purchase a ticket, and we will be in touch with the Zoom link very soon. So with that, a huge thank you to all of our speakers, and I'll be stopping the recording now.